Bienvenue à Montréal. It's really my pleasure. I'm Pierre-Olivier Pineau. I'm professor here, co-general chair for this conference. It's my pleasure to welcome you at HEC Montréal. We're hosting the 42nd International Energy Economics Association's conference. And we have a very good program in front of us. 3 days of exciting talks. Thanks to all of you who will be speakers in this conference to be here. It's because of you that we have a good conference. Yesterday evening, the worst nightmare of a conference organizer happened. Our plenary speaker's flight was, the opening plenary speaker, Chris Needle from the MIT, his flight was canceled yesterday evening, so he couldn't arrive yesterday evening. And so he had the morning flight. He was supposed to land at 7:45, and then his flight was, of course, delayed to 9:20. But then we're lucky because we have so many great people in our program. So I'll announce one change already. Before even starting the conference, there is one change. Mark Jaccard, who was supposed to be on the plenary, on the dual plenary, Energy Modernization and Transition, has accepted to take the role of Chris Needle. And Chris Needle, who's still supposed to arrive later this morning, will be here at 11, should be here at 11 and be in the program. So that was because of my stress. I shouldn't have announced that in this order, but because I'm a little bit stressed about this, I wanted to share with you this. But let me first say that the theme of the conference is local energy, global markets. We are an energy economics association, and all energy starts from a local perspective, and all issues now are global. Oil markets have been global from a long time. Natural gas markets are increasingly becoming global. Electricity markets are becoming global. Renewable energy has to move from where it's produced to where it's needed. So there are a lot of needs for thinking globally. And of course, climate change is a global issue. It's extremely related to energy issues. So energy economists cannot think about energy issues without thinking about climate change. The two are interrelated, and we need, as energy economists, we need to continue work on these issues and continue to discuss and especially spread out the information and the analysis, because the policy debate around the world and in my country and in every country, the energy debate is not as informed as it should be on energy policies. So I think we have a huge role, an important role as an association, the International Association for Energy Economics, to continue our work and to make sure that policymakers, the population, companies hear and discuss these issues, but in an organized way, informed by facts and informed by economics, because we cannot build a sustainable society if it's not based on sustainable economics. We need to price things correctly, we need to have the right policies, and I think we have a huge role to play in that matter. So that was my introduction to the whole conference. There'll be many occasions to discuss these issues, a lot of different perspectives. I will start by thanking those who made that conference possible beyond all of you, because of course it's because of you that this conference is possible. But we have great sponsors. Our sponsors are extremely important for us. You've seen them. The Quebec logo here is for Transition énergétique Québec. It's the Quebec agency for the energy transition. And they've been supporting this event from the beginning, so I would like to thank them deeply. And then Boralex also has been there, a platinum sponsor, has been there also from the beginning. I wish personally to thank them for their support, because we really appreciate your support for the conference and for the discussion we try to promote in Quebec, in Canada, and across the world. Boralex is a renewable energy company in different countries. You'll hear more about them later on this morning. And of course, we have other sponsors, Hydro-Québec, Desjardins, who's a financial institution in Quebec. We thank them for their support. CN, Enerchem, Énergir, the National Energy Board, Suncor, the Port of Montreal, and Osiaco are all great sponsors that have been supporting this conference, and we really thank them for their support. So I have a few more announcements. Well, another thing that is global, and that really was one source of stress for myself, and maybe some of you suffered from the visa process to be able to get into Canada. And I have to say that I was really saddened by the fact that a lot of people, we should be like 20 or 30 people more in this room, but the Canadian embassies across the world have been extremely bad at providing visas and providing the information to people that they will not get their visa. So as soon as last night and even this morning, I get emails from people telling me, sorry, Pierre-Olivier, I cannot make it to the conference because the Canadian embassy in my country did not give me the visa. And I'm really sad for all these people who couldn't come. I'm really sad that Canada is managing these visa issues this way, because not only aren't they providing the right information at the right time, but they're denying people the right to come and attend the conference. So I apologize for our Canadian embassies, and I'm ashamed of them. But thank you for being here. And those who went through the process, thank you for your willingness to go through that process. Because of visas, then so of course in the program you'll see you won't see in the printed program changes. Some people, unfortunately, will not be able to make their concurrent session because they couldn't come. So, of course, this is not a dynamic program because it's printed, but if you go on the web, then it's the more up-to-date version of the program. So for concurrent session, the web version is the one you should look at because that's the one we try to update. And so some talks, some plenary, not plenary, but some concurrent sessions will not happen as indicated. Well, they will happen, but some talks, some papers will not be presented as they are listed. It's a minority of these papers that will not be presented, but there are still a few, so just be aware of that. We have poster sessions, so I want to encourage you during the lunch today and tomorrow's lunch, we have about 20 posters, 10 today, about 10 today and 10 tomorrow. So during lunch, just go one stairs up and look at the posters that will be presented. We'll have a jury looking at these posters and basically nominating the best one. And there's a 1,000 Canadian dollar cash prize for the best poster, and we'll announce that on the closing plenary. So on Saturday, at the beginning of the closing plenary session, we'll announce the winner of the poster session. So I really encourage you to look at the posters. We'll have a few people who will look after the poster. We have a jury that will look and select the best poster, and we'll have that poster. We've been, those who stayed at the Delta yesterday told me about the water damage at the Delta Hotel. In the middle of the night, some of you just were woken up at 2 or 3 a.m. because of water damage. There's a lot of water issues in Canada these days and in the world. Flooding happens everywhere. Montreal was flooded. Well, some parts of Montreal were flooded, and we had in Quebec, in the province, about 10,000 households that had to move from their homes because they were living nearby a water area and it was flooded. And maybe by solidarity here at HEC, we also had some floods. And you won't see it. That happened a month ago. But because of the flooding, we had a water tank in the top of the building that cracked, and then basically for 10 minutes, water fell on one section of the building. If you see some construction on the first floor, just the floor above, you will see that. It's because of the flooding we had a month ago. So all rooms are fine. The rooms you will go into are all fine. But then there are some parts that have been affected by this flooding. So again, we apologize for that, but that's part of nature, I guess. A lot of flooding and probably more in the future, sadly. So we have a great team. I want to mention Johanne Whitmore, who's working very closely with me, and I would like to thank her for all her work in the conference. Sylvain Odette, Céline Georges are also part of the team. We have a team of volunteers that you'll see around. I thank them all for their involvement in the conference. The last thing I want to mention, because you're visiting Quebec and Canada, is the state of energy in Quebec. We're lucky in Quebec to have already a decarbonized electricity system, but we also, of course, use oil and natural gas, and we have wind projects in Quebec. If you want to learn more about the Quebec energy system, then you can download, and there's an ad at the end of the program. And so at the end of the program, you can see our ad. So it's a little bit of advertising. The state of energy in Quebec, it gives you all the information on the energy system in Quebec, our challenges. So please download that document. And as you're visiting here, we'll be happy to have your comments on that. So I've spoken already too long, and I want to introduce our president, the president of the International Association for Energy Economics, Christophe Bonnery, who will say a few words about the conference and will welcome you, and I'll come back right after him for slightly more introductions.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. As we are in an international conference, I'm going to speak English, but we can speak at the coffee break in French if you prefer. Welcome, everybody, dear colleagues, dear friends, Mr. President. The International Association for Energy Economics is pleased to be hosted and to organize the 42nd International IAEE conference in this country, Canada, in which all provinces, not only Quebec, bring to energy economists a real-scale case study. All energies are represented, all configuration of energy markets, all profile of consumers are present. Montreal was also, in 2005, the place where the 11th session of the Conference of Parties on Climate Change happened. I would like to sincerely thank HEC Montreal for welcoming us and of course, Pierre-Olivier Pineau and all his team for organizing this event. After recent international conferences in Perth, Daegu, New York, Antalya, Bergen, Singapore, Groningen, and before next year, Paris, where you are all welcome, of course, and followed by Tokyo, Riyadh, and Izmir in Turkey, setting the International Energy Conference in Montreal was a real must. I would like to thank the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Quebec, François Legault, and the Mayor of Montreal, Valérie Plante, for their high patronage. Our community of 4,000 energy economists present in 110 countries is willing to share the economic science with as many people as possible. As we have seen further to the Yellow Jacket demonstration in Paris, our challenge is to disseminate the academic excellence more widely to the public, because the opinions do not always understand the rationality of political choices. We are ready to contribute to this. We are ready to support the transformation necessary for environmentally friendly economic development and to guarantee access to energy to all. I am also pleased to announce that we have decided to share these visions to the international community by using much more social media. I invite you, all the participants, to share the information you find interesting and you appreciate by using the hashtag, which is displayed here, IAEE 2010 NTL on Twitter and any other means. Oil, nuclear, renewable energy, electricity networks, new trends for residential and industrial customers, energy and environmental policies, emerging technologies, commercialization of new services, energy poverty, all these topics will be addressed in these 3 days, and I thank the organizing team to find these topics. And now, for me, it's time to declare open the 42nd IAEE International Conference today in Montreal on May 13th. Thank you. I wish all of you a very good conference.
And now I'd like to give the floor to Julie Cusson, the Director of Public Affairs and Communication at Boralex. which is one of our sponsors, and then she'll welcome you and say a few words to us. Julie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. I am an economist myself, although it's been a while since I've predicted something. Therefore, let's start this great conference, if I may, with a bit of humor by telling you a joke, an economist joke. So, apparently, President Truman once said that he wants an economic advisor who is one-handed. Why, you would say? Because normally the economist giving him advice, economic advice said, on one hand, you have this, and on the other hand, you have this. So my name is Gélinas, Cusson, and rest assured, I'm not a stand-up comic. I work for Boralex, a Quebec-based business that develops, builds, and operates renewable energy sites in Canada, France, in the UK, and in the USA. We essentially focus on four types of energy production: wind, solar, hydroelectric, and thermal. We are the biggest independent onshore wind producer, power producer in France, and one of Canada's renewable energy leader. What's more, we will be celebrating next year our 30th anniversary. One thing is certain, the solid foundations that we've built in the last few decades mean we can now look to the future with optimism, regardless of what it may hold. Energy markets are changing at lightning speed, which is causing upheaval in many fundamentals. The fact is, energy markets are at the heart of our modern society, but the use of the energy is responsible for a phenomenal amount of GHG emissions, which has led to collective awareness about our planet's future. The arrival of renewable energies is a real solution to this challenge. Not long ago, renewable energies were seen as a pipe dream, a notion advocated by flower children. In the 2000s, at major industry events, most of the people that were there were wearing flip-flops and jeans. Today, what we have to do is look around and to realize that it's no longer the case, and far from it. At the conferences I attend, I'm seeing more and more people from the financial and investing sectors. In just a few years, renewable energy has gone from niche to mainstream, a market in which the competition is fierce and mostly fueled by the major oil and gas producers who are diversifying into this promising sector. So, how will the small players like us, like Boralex, be able to compete with such giants? By remaining agile, that's how. Our agility will always be our greatest strength, especially in a market in which the mid-size and large corporations will be interested in acquiring our services, and particularly because we understand their business situation better than the big utilities. I'd like to mention here that my colleague Hugues Girardin, VP Development at Boralex, will be participating in tomorrow morning's plenary session, the new business models, prosumers, and future grids location. And among other things, he will discuss our vision of the industry and the role a company like Boralex can be called upon to play in this new type of market. Although there is clear enthusiasm around the world in regards to the development of renewable energy projects, this doesn't mean that there's unanimity on the subject. I've been working in public and governmental affairs for the past 20 years, and I've watched how social acceptability is becoming a more complex matter. Fake news and social opposition have never been this present and strong in the public opinion. We are seeing more and more sensationalist headlines on the subject of wind energy in the media. And soon, I promise you, there's no doubt about it, it's going to focus on solar and energy storage. The crisis of France's Yellow Vest protesters is a good example with the introduction of the new gas tax as a disincentive of consuming oil. Although the crisis stems from a host of factors other than those related to the energy sector, it still attests to the climate of the market we're working in. And many countries have set truly ambitious targets in regards to reducing GHG emissions. Therefore, to achieve our goals, we must find effective ways to increase the social acceptabilities of projects. That's why I strongly believe that conferences like this one are so important. These are pivotal opportunities for deep discussion and constructive ideas, allowing us to build the world of tomorrow little by little. The global energy transitions holds challenges that are not solely related to finance, economic, engineering, or environment. There is room for everyone in this battle, and everyone's contribution and collaboration will be needed if we want to overcome the climate crisis for the good of future generations. Enjoy your conference.
Merci, Julie. And now I'd like to introduce Johanne Gélinas, the head of the CEO of Transition énergétique Québec, which is the energy transition agency in Quebec, and she'll tell more about it to you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I had a speech which was written for me in French, so I turned at the back of my sheet. I have a few notes now in English. So first of all, welcome you all to Montreal. It's a pleasure to have you here, and your presence is timely, and I will tell you a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Based on what I've heard from Pierre-Olivier, some of you had a bad start. The good thing about Montreal is that after work, we can all go downtown, party, and forget about all our problems. So tomorrow will be another day, and I hope that tonight you will take this opportunity to visit this great city. I was saying that your presence is timely. Last Saturday, our Prime Minister made his first speech on environment and climate change. He was somehow quite convincing that all the work that we have done here over the last couple years is the way forward. We will try to speed up and improve. He has mentioned that he wants to have an energy transition which will be pragmatic. I guess that coming from him, when we talk about being pragmatic, has to do with show me the business case. That's the way I understand it. So you are probably the best one to help us to demonstrate what is the value added to invest and not spend money, but invest money in energy transition. And moreover, when it comes to energy, our minister, Mr. Julien, who is an accountant himself, loves when we talk numbers with him. So for us, Transition énergétique, who are made of a bunch of people, very talented people, mostly engineers and economists, it's important to be partnered with HEC, to be partnered with Jacquard. They have done a lot of very, very good work over the years, and we are there to continue to support them. And I will say that I've spent myself most of my career in the public sector, building public policies. And it's clear for me that to have good public policies, we have to have knowledge. We have to have good knowledge to be able to support our proposals. And we also have to have a good basis also in terms of what is the value added in terms of social development and, of course, being aware of environmental protection. So all that to say that you are key to help us helping the world to get better. And even if I'm not myself an economist, I'm just a geographer, so I'm on the soft side of science, but still, I care about the environment, I care about social development, And I hope that over these 2 days, we will be able to look at what are the best public policies and how to make the business case to move ahead and get into real transition. I would like to thank you again, all the organizers. I know that a year ago, there was almost a white page. There was nothing, just this idea of, okay, we had to get prepared for this conference, and it's amazing how much you have achieved. The program is great, so enjoy, have fun, and don't forget, there's a life after work. Thank you.
Okay, so now would have been the time to introduce the opening plenary speaker, Chris Neal. His flight has just landed in the airport, so we won't wait for him because we will hear him in the dual plenary at 11 with other panelists. But I would like to introduce Mark Jaccard, who's a professor at Simon Fraser University. He is, all the bios of speakers are on the website. So in order to save time, I would just won't read the bio, but I invite you to go and read the bio. He's been a very active energy economist in Canada and throughout the world. He's published a lot of very interesting books on fossil fuels, sustainable fossil fuels, and more recently on how we can move ahead with the energy transition. Mark, I don't see you, but you're here. So please just come to the podium and the floor will be yours for the next hour, but we'll have questions and discussions after his talk. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's Pierre-Olivier. I think you've done a great job, and congratulate you on organizing this. I was reminded when you told me last night about the issue with Chris coming that I hosted, and Dave Williams reminded me that I hosted the IAEE conference in Vancouver back in 2003 or something like that, and don't worry, Pierre, always something goes wrong. And you won't be able to know what it is in advance. And Dave didn't remember this, but I remember it because it's burned into my brain that I had lined up also for the key speakers at lunch or dinner, the CEO of British Columbia Hydro and our local gas utility. And we had about a week to go, but I'd heard that the Queen of England, which is our queen in Canada, believe it or not, was coming to Vancouver, and I thought, well, that's interesting, okay. And then sort of 5 days before the conference, I get phoned by the CEO of the electric utility. Well, I'm at a luncheon with the queen, I can't give that talk. Then it was the head of the gas utility, well, I can't give the dinner talk. So at least you haven't had the queen come, because that can really wipe out your speaking. And I've never been, I guess, the keynote speaker at one of our conferences, the keynote speaker, but I have been a keynote speaker before, so I want to quelch any of the rumors I've been hearing that Chris Knittle's canceled flight had anything to do with the fact that my sister works for Air Canada. So, all right, I should get going here. I'll keep track of the time. It's quite funny when someone gives you a little extra time. That's dangerous because then I threw in only 2 more slides. I made myself not go crazy here. And I think there's some overlap. I know a little bit about what Chris will be speaking, so he'll speak in the plenary. He's switching places with me, and that would provide, I think, an interesting contrast because I tend to be one that is a little more really worried about the fact that we're failing on climate policy and therefore we need to listen to political scientists when we try to provide advice to politicians if they ask us for it. At the same time, I think Chris will say, and I support that we have to be really careful about saying that we're the ones that can give policy advice because policy happens in a bigger context. It isn't just the students in our economics classes at the university who will fail if they don't remember how a revenue-neutral carbon tax works and why it's good for them. So I want to talk about that. And And I point out that also, I, as a very young professor, and so it's a long time, but 1989, I was starting out, and the government of Canada sent me, because I think I was the only person in Canada who was even doing anything on climate energy economics, and they sent me to Paris to a meeting at the International Energy Agency because there'd been a meeting of political leaders, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and they had all agreed that we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So they said, I know, let's send economists from each country to the International Energy Agency in Paris, and they'll meet and figure out what to do. So, and I was there, and I was everyone else seemed quite senior compared to me, so I didn't say much. But we all agreed that there should be a carbon tax. We all knew Pigou, and it was kind of exciting. Here was an externality. Humanity was just making progress on acid emissions. It had already done well on smog. So we went, and I came back, and I didn't speak to the Prime Minister of Canada, Brian Mulroney, but to his director in whatever ministry it was, and I said, well, everyone agrees, do a carbon tax. And then I think the Swedes actually did, and also other Scandinavian countries, or at least they changed the name of some of their high fuel taxes and did align these on carbon content. And then we also talked about, well, what you would do is here's the price, and it would ramp up over time, and that would be nice and economically efficient, and that's how things would unfold. And so then what I have here now is to show you since that meeting 30 years ago, the U.S. carbon tax. So what did you miss? Here, there. So that's 30 years. That's a long time. And I know that, this is I'm trying a little humor here, but it's also kind of black humor, because since then, global emissions, at that time, we're at 22 gigatons of CO2, and now 37 or something like that. So I just think we have to pay attention to things like that and learn from it, and not just keep, saying if humanity can't get it right and listen to us economists, then to heck with them. Just let it go. I just can't do that anymore. So why is this global energy transition so difficult? Now, these are things that are pretty obvious to you. I'll run through them pretty quickly, but I find that I do this second slide to almost every talk I give, because when I hear people later on talking in, whether it's a question and answer, if I'm in a public talk, or in more of a professional setting like this, I just have to remind people, oh my God, what are all of these constraints out there? And also, I just wanted to set the context. What I'm going to be talking about isn't small little reductions in greenhouse gases. I'll be talking about, just as was just mentioned, energy transition. And I'll call it deep decarbonization, just because we're using that term a lot more. And I say that's something like a significant amount of greenhouse gas reductions. The percentages can be different because some people have different intensities of carbon to start out with. It's a very difficult global collective action problem. We all know about that. Global governance institutions are very weak, and they will remain so. There could be good reason for that, but on this problem, it's problematic. Richer and poorer countries aren't going to agree on a fair sharing of the cost burden. I know we meet every year, lots of great things are said. I and others, people wrote and predicted 20 years ago there wouldn't be an agreement if it's based on some kind of voluntary, non-tariff approach, and the years and decades go by. And at the same time, without something like global tariffs, global mandatory compliance mechanisms, then unilateral leadership is very difficult, right? Industry leakage, we all know about that, we study it. And then you'll run into, well, it's a small contribution that we can make. Even larger countries can say that, China and the United States. But even if greenhouse gas reduction was a nation-specific problem, so let's say that you could avoid climate change in your country by reducing your emissions, so you weren't caught up in this global collective action problem, it would still be very difficult. Fossil fuels are a wonderful source of energy, And they are incumbent. And that also means that there are corporate and regional interests who are very, you can say motivated, but I will even argue biased, many of them biased. And what I mean by that is cognitively biased, to look at evidence in certain ways that sustain as long as possible that role of fossil fuels. And that plays itself out in the political process and even in the cultural process. And we shouldn't be naive about that. Also, if we start to understand anything about politics, it's quite often we economists sit back and say, look how stupid those politicians are. Like, why did they do that? Or why didn't they do that? And I've told my grad researchers, and I've been saying this for almost 30 years, if we think we're so smart, we should be able to tell the politician what to do that does the right thing for a societal benefit passes any kind of benefit cost test, and gets them reelected. Now start to put that constraint on yourself and see how it works. So what happens is faking it policies actually have a very high political benefit cost ratio. One of those books I wrote was with a Canadian journalist, political journalist, Jeffrey Simpson, with our lead paper, Globe and Mail. The book was called Hot Air, but I learned a lot from him about seeing the world in a political cost-benefit perspective of a politician. And of course, the long horizon of an energy transition, of deep decarbonization, is not at all in sync with the electoral cycle. And that also means that politicians can say, I'm going to lower your gasoline prices today, and I'm going to hit that target in 2030. So we might know that doesn't make any sense, but they can get away with that. They can also get away with attacking specific policies. This thing is unfair for some reason or another. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit more today, especially with respect to the carbon tax. And as you'll see from my words, that I've had some experience with that. I'll get to that, but I was very much involved 14 years ago now, 12 years ago in designing British Columbia's carbon tax and in the discussions and debates we had within government on putting together that carbon tax. Now, so that's economists and this big challenge. And how do political scientists approach this? And I've been more interested in this and thinking about the carbon tax, a term like likelihood of implementation. Now, should that be part of our analysis? I'm not saying it should, but we should be paying attention to that kind of analysis or combining forces. Energy and climate economists learning from and working with and coordinating with political scientists, poli-science, and so on. And especially, I'm going to talk about the carbon tax. So many voters have been willing to, and some of that literature, I'm just going to give you one book to keep in mind, The Myth of the Rational Voter. And this is a book written by an economist, Brian Kaplan, I think his first name is Brian. And that book really had an effect on me because suddenly a lot of things made sense. And in there, just explaining about the general biases in the public compared to how economists see the world. And one of them is, to do with free trade and the gains of trade, and we're all probably familiar with that a lot of people don't understand the gains of trade, always a challenge. And another one is changes in taxes that can be societally beneficial, and that how much of the public, not all, but a significant portion, will just instinctively suspect that. And so again, that poses this dilemma to us. Oh, well, they better understand what we're saying, or to heck with it. We'll just all go to hell together, and we'll stay on that first graph I showed you. So that's the challenge. So, and an example of that is when we implemented that carbon tax in British Columbia in 2007, 2008, then some political scientists, colleagues of mine, also in British Columbia, we said, well, we'll do it revenue neutral. That'll be good. And we actually shifted some money. In the income tax cut we gave to industry was smaller than what we gave to households. And so actually there was a tax shift from industry to consumers. And our rule was, because the government said, whatever happens, this thing cannot be a tax increase, even by $1 for a person, because the media will make that huge. It's got to be revenue neutral. So we worked out that all our analysis with our models showed that about 80% of British Columbians were going to be net winners. Some wealthy people who drove really big cars a lot and had 2 homes heating all the time were the losers under the carbon tax. Everyone else pretty well gained. And yet the polls of political science, and we advertised that. We put that message out there. I was in the media all the time. I was radio shows, TV, op-eds, interviews. And this was a strong message coming from government and us. But on the other side was this huge amount of lies. Very concerted lies. And 70% of people just believed that it was revenue negative for them. It was a tax increase for them. So it's almost the opposite. And so again, I've talked about this likelihood of implementation of policy scientists. And so I want to pose one question though about our bigger energy efficiency, and then I'll get into the detailed stuff. But I just want to bug you a little bit with this thought here. Think about this deep decarbonization cost experiment. So assume that that in the real world, there are climate-sincere and climate-insincere politicians, and that's sort of what I've just been trying to describe to you, right? There will be climate-insincere. Are there policies that they can use to their advantage? How do you help the climate-sincere politician do things that, on a global basis, might be positive from a cost-benefit perspective? And so how might you combine that? So here's this simple trade-off analysis that I'll give to you. Nicholas Stern, and maybe I've got his numbers partly wrong, I can't remember exactly, but he estimated that, if we didn't want to go onto a 4C path, but instead on a 2 degrees Celsius path, that, ramping that down, that rate of emissions, the higher concentrations of atmospheric CO2, would be about 5% of GDP. And I think that was in present value terms or in year 2050, I can't remember. But not doing that, so saving money on not doing abatement, still burning fossil fuels, but would lead, and his estimate was 20% of GDP damages. And we know there's just wide probability distributions about this, but we do have to think about this. And everyone who did those, when he did those calculations and others, they assumed carbon tax, a global carbon tax. So that's the most economically efficient policy. And we really wouldn't want humanity to spend more than that 5% in order to get that benefit. But what if there were policies out there that had a much higher likelihood of implementation, but they were less economically efficient? What do you do with that? Now, does an economist just rant and rave and say, no, 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 or what do we do? Because again, it's to prevent the 20% of damages. Am I? Oh, is that shaking or? Okay. So, and what if we have 2 different likelihoods of implementation then, as you can see? The efficient approach has 20% likelihood, so the carbon tax, 20% likelihood of implementation. The less efficient one, which is really what I'm going to talk about today, 50%. So let's do an expected benefit cost analysis. You can work this out, right? 20 times the 5% damages, 80% chance of the 20% damages, expected 17% GDP cost, with the other, which I'm going to describe in a minute, flexible regulations, 12.5%. So in other words, is it possible that, so I'm just putting this out here for you, that by insisting on doing it one kind of way, we're actually not passing a benefit cost test, by insisting that we only think like energy economists when we're talking with politicians, and therefore actually are partly responsible ourselves for that first graph I showed you, and including myself. And if that were true, now for anyone who's from England will know this, but my mother would ask, isn't carbon tax insistence penny wise but pound foolish on climate policy? So I'm not getting much reaction from this audience because I think I'm too old, but if you'd had a mother like I had, you'd have a lot of sayings like that. So, and the British should know about this one. So just the idea that I've saved money by, we've got to have the carbon tax or exactly the most efficient economic policy, but in the long run, I've contributed to something that is really negative in a benefit cost sense. And there are economists who will talk this way, and this is where everyone in their speech trots out some Nobel Prize winner. If you go through enough Nobel Prize winning speeches, you can find almost anything you need for your speech. So I've got mine. And so James Buchanan, economists should cease proffering policy advice as if they were employed by a benevolent despot who can implement a carbon tax, and they should look to the structure within which political decisions are made. So I call upon my fellow economists to postulate some model of the state of politics before proceeding to analyze the effects of alternative policy measures. I urge economists to look at the constitution of economic polity to examine the rules, the constraints within which political agents act. So I'm not saying that's the be-all and the end-all. I think you can go in dangerous directions with that as well, so I'm putting that out there as a provocation, not as the only way to look at things. And so that's the point I just made. Should we economists ignore evidence of humanity's failure on climate and just blame the politicians, or could we be more helpful by understanding why they choose alternatives to carbon pricing and try to make these alternative policies better? And that will be the second half of my talk here. And to start this off, so California, I'm going to use California as an example now. California has a cap and trade system, and it's economy-wide, unlike the European one. And I think it's something to be proud of. I think it's a very effective, interesting policy. It hasn't been easy to develop. But I'm someone who I model energy economy systems, as you're going to see from some results I show, and I'm always interested in running our models over and over again with just one policy, like this is what I make my team do. And what is the incremental contribution of individual policies? Now, in the case of California, the California Air Resources Board also it puts out data like this. So here's a figure from them, a pie, showing the different contributions of policies to their greenhouse gas reductions from business as usual. And California, I would argue, is the jurisdiction doing the most in North America, at least, because Ontario shut its coal plants. It did quite a lot, actually, from business as usual. British Columbia, where I'm from, has done quite a lot. But California, I would argue, if you look where the emissions were headed, has done a fair bit. And here is a crude pie chart that they did. It's not exactly the way I would do it, but I wanted to show you there is and this is an estimate of what's been going on and sort of going forward for less than a decade. What will be the contribution to greenhouse gas reductions? And so there you see the carbon pricing. It's not a carbon tax, although it often gets accused of being a carbon tax. And I will call it a carbon tax because it's explicit carbon pricing. And then there are other regulations that I'm going to call flexible regulations, and I'll explain why, and that's the two slides I allowed myself to enter into, is to really make sure we're all on the same page. But the clean cars will be California's vehicle emission standards, and people would have heard of the ZEV, the Zero Emission Vehicle Standard. I've been especially interested in the role in the past of the LEV, the Low Emission Vehicle Standard, and the ULEV, the Ultra Low Emission Vehicle Standard. The low carbon fuel standard, I'm going to show you a simulation for Canada of that model, and I'll explain that in greater detail. And the renewable portfolio standard in energy. So what you're seeing here is that to have the explicit carbon pricing be the lead role. And in fact, because of these other policies, as they ramp up the stringency of those policies, they undermine the role of the price in the cap and trade system. And that's why it was good that when designing the cap and trade, part of it was, as we economists have published a lot on, was, well, could you put a floor price and a ceiling price? And so you'd have it so that the cap and trade had similarities to a carbon tax, auction some of the permits so that you can do something with the revenue. And they've done that, but they, except for maybe the odd auction, the floor price in there always is threatening to always be the dominant price because other things, higher cost, knock down emissions and undermine the role of the pricing from the cap and trade. So just want to make sure that, flexible regulations, market-oriented instruments, people will have other terminology for this. I'm on the IPCC policy chapter again, and haven't been for a long time, but we're debating what to name some of these policies, for one thing. I'll call them flexible regulations right now. That seems to work when I'm describing them to politicians or the media. So it's a performance standard which obligates all, and I'm going to go quickly on this because I think most of you know this quite well. You have to meet, individual firms have to meet a requirement, but it's also going to, because it's on every firm, it's going to end up having an aggregate market outcome in that sector of the economy. So they're not economy-wide, they're sector-specific, like requiring renewable electricity, low and zero-emission vehicles, or even decreasing industrial emissions intensity. Some people could call, and then this is where we get in a gray area between, is this really just like carbon tax, which would be great, or is it not? And we have those debates in Canada with some of our policies, and I'm sure other jurisdictions do too. So it has this flexibility, though, because those who are under the regulation, the firms delivering fuels, the firms making electricity, can trade them, can do various things. First of all, they're not told they have to have a certain technology or fuel. So we can figure out and let the markets decide that, whether it's from consumer preferences or the competition or innovation that happens on the production side. And it allows them to trade to reduce compliance cost. So just to recap, is that a form of carbon pricing? No, but it's an implicit pricing. And you can work backwards and figure out what the price is. And I'll talk about that, but you can even look at the low carbon fuel standard today in California, figure out the trading, and which I'm getting ahead because I'm going to talk about that in a second. So in transportation, now I should say that as the economist in me still, for example, when I was recommending things to the government or helping the government with its own thoughts 12 years ago, I was still, the economist in me was trying to say, don't do too many things. Like, politicians want to look like they're active, so they're always trying to add in more stuff. The economist wants one price signal. So you're trying to say to them, do you need to have a zero-emission vehicle standard and a low-carbon fuel standard? When our political leaders in British Columbia 12 years ago got really excited about out-Schwarzenegging Arnold Schwarzenegger, so when they wanted everything that he had done. And so if California was doing a vehicle emission standard and a low carbon fuel standard, I did a bunch of analysis showing why you didn't need both actually, but they may do that. So I'm just going to make sure that you're aware of these two things. But again, I'm going to go quickly. So it's a certain percentage of sales can trade among themselves. That's with vehicles. Quebec now has a zero-emission vehicle standard, and British Columbia does as well. Low-carbon fuel standard, California has it, British Columbia has it. So it's the full-cycle carbon intensity. So it looks upstream if there's electricity used, and it's called fuels, which I hate. I call it the low-carbon energy in transportation standard, and I can understand why they don't choose what I pick, but because it's, as an energy economist, I still think of fuels as liquid fuels or something like that, and they mean electricity could be in here, hydrogen, biogas, you name it, because it's wide open. It's saying any energy used in transportation, used in a car, used in a bus, doesn't matter. The sellers have to reach a carbon intensity target, and they even have to go upstream. So, it's electricity. How was the electricity produced? What's the carbon intensity of that electricity? It's gasoline. Where did the gasoline come from? It's biofuels. What was the carbon intensity of the biofuel production process? So if I have a biofuel that comes from a low emission process, or maybe even negative, where someone's, growing trees, making a biofuel, but also burying some CO2, then I will get a bit more credits under a trading system for bringing more low carbon intensity in. And people who are higher carbon intensity in these fuel regs will have to give me money, all right, so that they meet their requirement. And that's similar with the vehicle emission standard. Think of Tesla as, because it's 100% of its sales are electric, and the ZEV mandate might be 5%, then it can sell it can get credits that it sells to other vehicle manufacturers for 90% of the vehicles it sells. And then it'll just depend on what's the trading price. So if you have more questions on this, you can ask me afterwards, but I should move on. So because of this period I'm telling you about in my home province of British Columbia, where I was quite involved, it actually ended up being this quasi-experiment, which we're always looking for as researchers, because the government implemented a bunch of policies at the same time. And while I can calculate, and my research group did all the modeling for the government on the implications of each one of those policies, on their combined effect. So we're, every one of our dreams were written up in the main government document done by us. But it also meant that afterwards we could do all sorts of stuff. The research team, we just started brainstorming, what can we test? We also hooked up with some of the political scientists who were shocking us with some of these results about how people perceived the carbon price and other policies. And so we surveyed 400 people to just sort of, how do you feel about these different policies, policies for which we were able to figure out how much emission reduction each one would cost to the year 2020. This is the year 2007, 2008. And so each one individually or their combined effects, and we were able to figure out their expected average and marginal costs as well. And I won't give you all of that because I want to focus in. Or I'll just give it very briefly. The carbon tax would get about 6 megatons of annual reductions by 2020, about half in transportation, half in electricity, a little bit elsewhere. The clean electricity standard, so think of that as a renewable portfolio standard, but I had a role in that, and I kept saying, don't call it a renewable portfolio standard. Why can't we put carbon capture and storage be allowed to compete? Why can't nuclear power be allowed to compete? Why can't some types of cogeneration? And so they defined what clean meant and did a clean electricity standard. So it is more flexible than a renewable portfolio standard. So I'm just trying to keep my credentials with my fellow economists here. Fought hard for that. And then the low carbon fuel standard. So what the policy people said to us was, environmentalists will say, oh look, 55% of people support the carbon tax and 45% against. Politician, go and implement that. Policy analysts and those who are really intimate with governments will tell you that that's not what they look at. They look at the size of strong opposition, because strong opposition is what really matters when it gets into the political battles as they go on. And it isn't just strong opposition, it is how powerful is the group that opposes. It can be, so it's not just that, I'm simplifying, but that's a big one. And so so we did that survey, and just very quickly here, what I'm showing you is here's 5 of the main policies on the left. Energy efficiency regulations, I'm not going to talk about it again. Carbon tax, the low carbon fuel standard that I just mentioned, the clean electricity standard. So I really want to talk about those 3. And what you see here is that, yes, so people were, first of all, when we surveyed them, a lot of them, we said, which ones do you know about? That's already shocking. To tell my students, you must understand the rest of the public doesn't care what we do. And they don't think it's very important at all. We just had this huge debate over carbon tax, and only 25% of people had heard of the carbon tax. After 3 days of the whole election campaign was on the carbon tax. So the ones who did know about it were mostly the ones who had voted against it, or sort of intellectual, educated, green-leaning people. And yet, the majority of people still supported the carbon tax, but look at the size of its strong opposition relative to the strong opposition to those other 2 policies. So that's the only point I'm just trying to make, is just, is that important? Well, to policy analysts, it's really important. And are we aware of that? And then, so yeah, 7 to 10 times more strong opposition. And the interesting thing was that clean electricity standard we figure produced about 15 megatons of CO2 reduction. So if you were to have some kind of, we think of economic cost per ton reduced. Imagine you could calculate political cost per ton reduced, and it would be very different. Now, I'm just going to end off my last 4 slides, I'm good for time, with then using some of our modeling tools to run out some comparisons of this. And in this case, I'm especially interested in so Canada right now, we're decarbonizing our electricity system. We had the advantage of provinces like Quebec and British Columbia that were all hydropower anyway, so the Canadian system was sort of 60%, something like that, hydropower. And so now the federal government has passed a regulation to phase out all coal-fired power by 2030. It's already in the books, that regulation. People are acting on it. Then there's still battles over how much of that will be natural gas versus zero emission, and there are a whole set of policies involved with that, which I won't talk about. But it means that the transportation sector in Canada, like in California, is becoming more and more important if you're going to decarbonize, and like it is in Norway, sort of the last spot. And so now, studies of the low carbon fuel standard, and I know Chris Niddle has known some of those and done some of those, and maybe he'll talk about those in the next session. They'll often show that it has 2 to 5 times the cost of a carbon tax. And so we've really followed that literature, and we've noticed some things about it. Because at the same time, I'm like, if you tried to reduce all of Canada's emissions with a low carbon fuel standard as your only policy countrywide, versus a carbon tax, what are the similarities and differences? Both of them, they affect prices, so they're going to affect responses, and so they're going to have some of these similar efficiency effects, but they're not going to be identical. And right away, I know the carbon tax is going to be better, economically efficient, but I'm interested in how much better. And I'm not interested in how much better for just little tiny changes as so far has happened in California or British Columbia. I'm interested in it for deep decarbonization, for the energy transition. So that's the kind of thing that we've been simulating, and those are the final results that I'm about to show you. So when the other studies have assumed that low carbon fuel standard, where the studies that I've been looking at, Holland and others, is where it's used for sort of a 10% reduction instead of that deep decarbonization that I'm talking about. And so there's not a great price signal coming out there for all the other things that will happen, which I'll run through in a second. Also, some of these studies have sort of, biofuels. Yes, they are 20% less emissions per liter or per effective liter than is gasoline, and that's because the farm is using tractors that burn fossil fuels, and the processing plant burns fossil fuels to make the biofuel, and the fertilizer is from... So what happens, though, when you're running a policy that instead says, no, this is your life cycle emissions, we're going for deep decarbonization? Pretty soon you create incentives for people to produce biofuel. The ones who already produce biofuels with very low carbon intensities, they make a lot more money. So you start to shift what goes on upstream as well. Plus, although I won't specify here, we make assumptions about what policies you would do in other sectors. You're not going to just decarbonize one sector. And some of those studies also exclude hydrogen, electricity, and so on. And yet we know that a low carbon fuel standard, the ones functioning in California and British Columbia, allow anything that to compete with gasoline and diesel. So we instead, as I said, tested the low carbon fuel standard and carbon tax for a 65% greenhouse gas reduction to the year 2050. So you notice I said 65%. So this isn't 100%. Marginal costs can get up really high, but it's a significant amount. And we tested it with 2 models, a model that I'm somewhat known for and certainly published in the Energy Journal and elsewhere, called SIMS, which is an energy economy simulation model. It's more at the microeconomic level. It has some macroeconomic aspects, but really it's only equilibrium between energy supply and demand. And we also ran this with a computable general equilibrium model that is somewhat technology rich. And so I'm just going to give you those results and then conclude and open up for questions. So what would happen to prices? So think about this. This is kind of fun. So what would happen to retail prices? This is under the carbon pricing dominant scenario, so you're mostly using the carbon tax to get that 65% reduction to the year 2050, then the carbon tax goes up. Now remember, we're achieving about the same reduction in emissions in the year 2030 and all the way up. It's the same reduction in emissions. So you say, why is the retail gasoline price not rising as quickly under the low carbon fuel standard? Of course, the reason is what's driving up the price under the low carbon fuel standard is that people who are selling gasoline need to buy more and more credits, and they've got to pay more as it gets more expensive, and to subsidize renewables, to subsidize the electricity through the credit trading, subsidize electricity, subsidize biofuels. Because they're doing that, the gasoline retail price doesn't rise as fast for the same amount of reductions in the year 2020, 2025, and so on. Because unless, under your carbon pricing regime, if you took all the carbon pricing revenues and used that revenue from transportation to subsidize people providing electricity for electric cars and people providing biofuels, then you'd have the same effect as the low carbon fuel standard. Now, the political scientists will also tell you, well, there's real optics differences, and some people will argue, well, the low carbon fuel standard is hiding the price. And sometimes I say, fine, whatever. We're in a dire strait here, as per the initial slide I showed you. So there's that, what I just showed you. The blue line is simply if nothing happened. So I just happen to have that. Here's what happens to vehicles under each. It's about identical. There's some differences. The blue is the decline of gasoline vehicles, needless to say, and the gray is pure electric, and you've got some ethanol 85, and we've all run models like this, and I'm saying that's just one way of portraying the decarbonization. I'm not going to live or die on that. But what I wanted to talk about is a couple of aspects of the results, of the differences. So, and why are there differences? So the LCF is a flexible regulation that a low stringency would cause increased vehicle use if biofuel, well, I don't even know if I should go into this, but you could even have perverse outcomes where the subsidy, the lowering of the cost of renewables actually leads to more driving than would have happened. And if the renewables are like almost 85% as CO2 intensive as gasoline, emissions, you could have perverse effects where emissions go up in the early phases of a low carbon fuel standard. And that's what some of the literature has shown. And that's what I'm trying to get beyond by focusing on using this policy for deep decarbonization. Because as that stringency rises, what happens? They both end up raising mobility cost. So there will be so those of us who model all of these responses to price, there will be a small mobility demand reduction, so less person kilometers per year. Vehicle mobility is also rising in cost on average, right? Both with gasoline and the alternatives, because the alternatives have their costs, operating and capital, and that causes more of a mode shift towards transit or cycling or whatever, and more efficiency in the vehicles. So see, these other studies said, there's no efficiency gains, but there are. Under both the low carbon fuel standard and the carbon tax, if used for deep decarbonization. And of course, they raise the cost of gasoline vehicles relative to the others. So the big thing is the fuel switch, which was the slide I just showed you, moving from one type of car to another. So modest effects for mobility, use costs, and so on. And we've been able to calculate some of the average. I don't trust so much the marginal cost from this, but the average cost of that big change under the carbon tax might be something like $130 per ton CO2, and under the low carbon fuel standard, something like $180. I wouldn't want my future to rest on those being the right numbers, but it's somewhere in that kind of ratio. So here's just a slide to show you this example. So I'm just going to, the other side is 2050, and I just want to draw your attention to transit. So what you'd see is the reference case, the dark blue. Here's how many people are using transit. So that's the breakout of the kilometers traveled. You can see that under the carbon tax, there's slightly more, right? Because of that higher price effect. So I'm just trying to show you all the responses out there. It's almost entirely the fuel switching in vehicles. I know people would like us to not drive anymore, but that's not what our model shows with the elasticities that we have. Likewise, on the heavy freight sector, again out in the year 2050, you see that the balance of rail and truck for heavy freight is slightly different between these. But I'm just showing you this to show you both of these policies have these effects, the full effects that economists say will minimize the costs. But yes, the effects are not the same, and that's what our modeling is showing. And finally, what does this mean in terms of GDP? So running it through our general equilibrium model, and I'm just focusing again on the year 2050, and this is the transport sector's share of GDP, 0.5% loss, with the carbon tax, 0.7%. So obviously, I do believe we should be very honest about what is the cost of these alternative policies, but I'm very interested in us seeing how big is that. So this relates back to my very first thought experiment about that I said penny wise and pound foolish, which is there's that gap. Isn't that useful information for a politician? If we've said that we don't think we should make that decision, let's at least give them that information. Final slide. In conclusion, we've been telling politicians that the energy transition requires carbon taxes, and we've even claimed that these are essential. Now, this is a bit of a sore point that Pierre-Olivier knows about, but we've had an eco-fiscal commission created in Canada. It's phasing out now. It was economist funded, and even their document said carbon tax is essential. You cannot reduce greenhouse gas emissions without that, which of course is not true. And so what it does is it's helped defeat or frighten off the climate-sincere politicians from acting, in my view. And I showed you the evidence for that. So, and then the point is that even when, so what I'm also interested in is the jurisdictions and sectors around the world where we've actually had a quick transition, 10 to 15 years. And I won't talk about those, but I just throw those out there as thoughts. Maybe you have some others. And what were the policy mixes that caused that? Carbon taxes played a role sometimes? Absolutely. Thank goodness. But it's not as simple. And so I think most likely humanity is going to keep failing to implement policies at the stringencies needed for deep decarbonization. And I think that rather than just promoting carbon taxes and only showing the efficiency losses of regulations, we economists might work on sort of long-run cost implementation of making some of those regulatory choices that the politicians are going to make and making them a little bit better, especially for thinking about not incremental change, but deep decarbonization. And so in that sense, that we, us as a profession, can better help politicians with Mission Impossible. Thank you very much.
So we do have time for questions. So anyone, just go to the microphone and let Mark drink a glass of water. But you can still start with your question, maybe there, and then we'll go. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. So this is great. You had mentioned earlier on in the talk that Canada has decided to phase out coal by 2030. I think Germany just more or less is in the process of doing the same. Given your your taxonomy of instruments, I think that would fall outside of the flexibility to some extent in that it's a lot more prescriptive. So I'm curious whether you have any thoughts on, given the political feasibility and consensus building opportunities for those kinds of policies, whether they could be subject to the same or should be subject to the same kind of analysis in deciding what kinds of policies to implement.
Thank you. Yes. So you're absolutely right. Sort of a a government saying we're phasing out the coal plants by a certain date, you know, has no, us economists are like, okay, but where's the rationale or the benefit for that? At the same time, I mean, I am being affected by the very first slide I showed that nothing's happening. And the more I analyze the planet, the more I think coal plant phase out in wealthy countries as a requirement may make sense, because I think the costs overall of replacing, maybe not every jurisdiction, are reasonable for us in wealthy countries to try to set a model and then start using various pressures to get the developing world to do the same. So then the question becomes is what policy did you put in place for the electric sector at the same time, or you know, as you made that requirement for the coal plant phase out? So, and there, I think Canada's been doing some really interesting work. So we have, we're talking about something called an output-based pricing system. It's just a system that gets some proper price signals about carbon price into the operating decisions of new facilities, of facilities that are there, so that it, you know, helps to how fast you get rid of the coal, and Alberta's doing that. And now Canada's copying that. And also, if we are saying, though, that we want a certain amount of, we don't just want natural gas to replace the coal, then there are things like renewable portfolio standards for procurement, for competitive wholesale procurement, but those should be designed as broad as possible and, you know, and as competitively as possible. So that would be the corollary of saying, okay, I did this thing, let's phase out coal plants. What's going to end up in that sector?
2 points. The first one is the the clean fuel standard. Most of the clean fuel would come from ethanol-based fuel, essentially, or corn-based ethanol. And has anyone considered the EROI, the energy return on energy invested in producing such ethanol? Because when we do, you know, if we produce enough fuel from corn, the ethanol is so low, it becomes a real burden for society. If I look at your slide there, it says Brazil fuel, which would be sugarcane-based ethanol, that works. But corn-based hardly works. The second point I'd like you to elaborate on is carbon tax. What about consumption-based versus production-based? Because the way the system is geared now, it's better for one to produce a carbon-intensive or have the carbon-intensive good produced in another country and import it, because there is no duty on that. There is no border tax on carbon, while if we worked on a consumption base, it would de facto be there.
Right. So your first question, you said that most of the what would replace gasoline would be ethanol. And so that's not what we're showing. I blew past that graph, but electricity ended up being most important, as well as ethanol. But if you're using biofuels, then you will be able to look at what is the carbon content of them, and that's the life cycle carbon content. So that's why Brazil's fuel scores very well. And so this system would discourage, especially used for a deep decarbonization, would encourage the shifts you want, but it all depends on how you set your regulations. And of course, there will be other regulations always in agriculture. How are we making corn-based ethanol, and so on. So I'm not saying any of that should go away. Your second one was consumption-based versus production-based, and there are just it's a huge answer to that. I'm very familiar with it, and so the basic thing that we've agreed at through the United Nations negotiation processes is the system that we're currently doing, and I can defend that one. But because basically, if we send oil to China, then that's fine that we did that. And if the Chinese are going to burn that oil, instead of converting it to hydrogen and burying the carbon, that's their business. But they should be charged for making that choice when they get that fossil fuel. So that's the argument for the system we have now, which is well, you said carbon tax, but I think you're really asking about carbon allocation of emissions. Where are emissions? And I say emissions, the economist in me says emissions should be where they're happening or as close as possible, and that's where we should charge for it as well.
I really like the point about the myth of the rational voter, and it reminds me of, in another context, when Amartya Sen criticized economists as having the rationalism of fools, by always insisting on a simplistic, which helps our models of rationality. But I think we should hope for rational models of irrationality, that is, to understand how the irrationality works. And therefore, I wonder, why is it that models which have, as I've understood it, although you said you weren't getting into the weeds, a kind of cap and trade basis, which in my country, the United States, conservative politicians would always say, well, cap and trade is really cap and tax. It's really a tax. Why is it that the California cap and trade system got bad press as essentially a tax, whereas what you're calling flexible regulations, which have a kind of a cap and trade, is what gives the flexibility to them, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
Why do they get the good press?
Right.
So that's my question.
Excellent question. So the survey that I talked about had a whole bunch of results in it, and we published 3 papers from that. And we even have cap and trade in there as well, but I didn't include it in my results because it wasn't implemented in British Columbia. We actually passed legislation to do cap and trade in this shotgun approach, but we were waiting for Arnold Schwarzenegger to put, and he didn't do it. So we put in the carbon tax to show, our premier did that to show that he could outmuscle Arnold Schwarzenegger. But in the survey, and my PhD student who did all that, she's now a professor in public policy, and so she's gone from economics over to the dark side, and I think it's this research that did that for her. And I asked her about this the other day. I said, wasn't there embedded in those results also questions about cap and trade? And she said cap and trade was sort of right between the flexible regs and carbon tax. And in a way that makes sense because so think of the climate insincere politicians. They know about where the strong negative on policy is, so they're going to especially try to call it cap and tax. That worked let's go back, sorry. That worked in Ontario, next door. For us, it's just central Canada. But that worked in Ontario, and the government was just elected saying it would get rid of the cap and tax system, So and what she told me was that in the results, it was right sort of halfway in between. And I think because it still is this explicit price. It doesn't mean I'm saying hide the price. I'm also saying, though, that words like coal plant phase out, clean fuel, renewable electricity, those are things that it's easier for a public who's concerned about climate change. Those are the names of policies that it's easier to get behind. But that's my speculative guess on those differences, and I leave that to the political scientists or to my good student Katja in her next. They've told me that they've just done a survey like our previous one that includes California as well now, and I'm dying to see those results in the next couple of weeks. Thanks. Last question.
Hi. So as someone who actually works in the policy space, I found your presentation to be particularly interesting. So I wanted to ask more about the Canadian perspective right now, and if you guys have done any work in the sense of, so right now within the federal government, we're developing an OBPS, carbon pricing, and now we're working on developing a clean fuel standard. The provinces of BC and Quebec have also put in place ZEV mandates, and Canada now has a ZEV strategy as well. Have you guys kind of looked at the interface between these various different policies and the efficiencies that come about from it? We've heard from industry quite significantly that there's significant confusion around the interactions between the carbon pricing and with the low carbon fuel standard, and now there's ZEV mandates. So I was just curious to know if you guys have done work in that area or on the efficiencies as well.
That's about 80% of what we're doing. So, and a lot of the work done across Canada is by a consulting group called Navius, which is former students of mine, all of them. And so even the results I was just giving you were all things that we have all done together. And various groups try to bring that before the federal government, and we know it is listened to, but we also know that industry is able to produce reports continuously. So it seems like that's what you've noticed, and I don't blame, you're gonna have to dig a little harder, get a hold of me, there's lots of good stuff that we're doing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.